In the summer of 1518, in the city of Strasbourg, a woman named Frau Trophäa walked into the street and started dancing. Nobody asked her to. Nobody was playing music. She just danced. And she couldn't stop. Not after an hour, not after a day, not after a week. By the end of the month, over 400 people had joined her, convulsing in the streets, dancing until their feet bled, until their bodies gave out, until some of them died. And the government's solution? They hired more musicians. This is the story of the dancing plague of 1518, one of the strangest, most terrifying, and most real events in human history. And to this day, nobody fully knows what caused. To understand what happened, you need to understand the world these people lived in. Strasbourg in 1518 was a city on the edge of collapse. The previous year had brought failed harvests. People were starving. Syphilis was spreading through the population. Floods had wiped out crops. A fever called the English sweat was killing people across Europe. The peasants of Strasbourg were not just poor. They were desperate. Desperate in a way most of us cannot imagine, the kind of desperation where you genuinely believe God has abandoned. Enter Frau Trophäa. On a hot July morning, she stepped into the street in front of her house and began to dance. Her husband watched from the window, horrified. She didn't speak. She didn't acknowledge. She simply moved, arms flailing, feet stamping, body twisting for hours without stop. By nightfall, she was still going. Her feet were bleeding through her shoes. By the fourth day, she hadn't eaten, hadn't slept, was barely conscious, and yet she kept dancing. When city officials finally had her carried away, something even stranger happened. Others started. First a handful, then dozens. Within a week, 34 people were locked in the same uncontrollable movement. By August, the number had climbed to over 400 men, women, children, elderly, all dancing in the streets of Strasbourg, unable to stop. Witnesses described their eyes as glazed, their expressions blank, like they were somewhere else entirely. Now here is where the story goes from strange to insane. The city's physicians examined the dancers, reached a conclusion. This was caused by hot blood. Their official medical diagnosis was that the victims' blood had simply become too hot, and the only cure was to let them dance it out. So the Strasbourg City Council did something extraordinary. They rented out the grain market. They cleared the guild halls. They even constructed a wooden stage. And then they hired professional dancers to join the afflicted, to keep them company, to help them dance through illness. They hired musicians, drummers, pipers. They were essentially throwing a festival for people who were dancing themselves to death. At the peak of the plague, historians estimate that 15 people per day were dying from heart attacks, strokes, and sheer exhaustion, all while the city band played on. It took a local bishop stepping in, declaring it a curse from St. Vitus, a Christian martyr associated with dancing, to finally shut the music down. The afflicted were loaded onto wagons, transported to a mountaintop shrine, given red shoes, and forced to shuffle around a statue of the saint as priests prayed over them. Within weeks, inexplicably, it stopped. Every single one of them. And Strasbourg never spoke of it publicly again. For 5 centuries, historians have tried to explain what happened in Strasbourg, and there are 3 main theories, each one more fascinating than the last. Theory 1, ergot poisoning. Ergot is a fungus that grows on the bread crop these people ate every single day. When consumed in large quantities, ergot causes hallucinations, convulsions, and involuntary muscle spasms. Some historians believe the entire city was essentially tripping, that the rotten harvest had contaminated their food supply with enough ergot to trigger mass neurological episode. This theory sounds convincing until you realize one thing. Ergot typically causes rigid muscles, not the fluid, exhausting movement these people display. Theory 2, mass psychogenic illness. This is the theory most modern researchers support. Mass psychogenic illness, sometimes called mass hysteria, is a documented medical phenomenon where psychological stress manifests as real physical symptoms and spreads person to person like a virus. The human brain, under extreme trauma and stress, can make the body do things that seem physically impossible. And remember, these people were starving, dying, and genuinely believed they were living through the end of days. The psychological pressure in Strasbourg in 1518 was almost incomprehensible. When Frau Trophäa began dancing, others didn't choose to follow. Their brains, already primed by fear and desperation, simply broke. And the city's response, the music, the stages, the public spectacle, made it worse. It gave the illness an audience, which is the single worst thing you can do for mass psychogenic illness. Accidentally prescribed the correct treatment: isolation, prayer, and the removal of the spectacle. Theory 3. Religious ecstasy. Some historians believe this was not a plague at all, but a form of spiritual protest. Several religious sects in medieval Europe practiced ecstatic dancing as a form of worship. Some scholars believe Frau Trophäa may have been a member of such a sect, and that what began as a religious act was misinterpreted by city officials as madness, sparking genuine panic that cascaded into real illness. The truth is, we don't know. 500 years later, the dancing plague of 1518 remains one of the most documented and least understood events in European history. But here's what keeps me up at night about this story. Mass psychogenic illness didn't end in the Middle Ages. It has been documented in schools, factories, and communities across the modern world as recently as 2012, when 18 teenagers in Leroy, New York simultaneously developed uncontrollable facial tics and verbal outbursts that doctors couldn't explain. It disappeared in weeks, just like Strasbourg. The human mind, under enough pressure, can make the body betray itself in ways science still can't fully explain. And maybe that's the real lesson of Strasbourg. These weren't crazy people. They weren't weak people. They were ordinary men and women crushed under unbearable weight, and their minds found the only exit they could. Frau Trophäa danced for 7 days straight before she collapsed. We don't know if she survived. We don't know why she started. But in the summer of 1518, one woman's breakdown became a city's catastrophe and a mystery that has never been solved. If history teaches us anything, it's that the most terrifying things that have ever happened to humanity weren't monsters or natural disasters. They were us. If this story disturbed you, wait until you hear about the laughing epidemic of Tanganyika. That one's even stranger. Video dropping S.